Hi, I'm Stassi Schroeder. On my podcast, I share candid updates from my personal life, chat with some of my best friends about what's going on in our lives, give commentary on the latest pop culture headlines, and sometimes deep dive into random topics I'm obsessed with, like human design. It's a bit all over the place, but that's how I like it. And you will too. Listen to my podcast, Stassi, wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, we finish our look at the Lake Oconee murders. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my comely co-host, Alice.
What?
Comely, I am told,
I have no idea what that means.
Is the opposite of homely.
Homely?
So, I guess it means you're not like a warm fire and a cup of coffee on a beautiful afternoon in your home. You're cold and unwelcoming is what I assume it means, since it's the opposite of homely. But
you can't use words that I can't understand. Well, there's so many words I don't understand right now, but thanks, Brett. Thank you so much. Those of you who are listening, this is an amazing feat with a 1-month-old. We are recording back-to-back nights, and we'll see how this goes.
Yep.
Every day is an adventure is all I have to say.
Baby's already been crying once, so we're going to see. May have to take some breaks.
It was the baby or it was Brett. We don't know which one.
Yeah, but we'll see. We're going to get through together, so that's what matters. Okay, but we are recording back-to-back. For those of you listening when this comes out, last week, you heard our first episode on the Lake Oconee murders, one of the most bizarre cases that we have looked at, the murders of Russell and Shirley Dermond, and we are getting back into it, and hopefully the fact we're doing this back to back will just make this even better. This episode is going to be amazing, and maybe we can solve it by the end, though I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably not. A couple of podcasts that have covered this. If you want more coverage, True Crime Garage did some good episodes on this. So did the Deviant podcast. I really like that podcast, so you can check that out. But why don't we dive right back in where we left off? So we've been talking about this murder, but we had not yet gotten to the cause of death. So at this point, you have Russell, who's been found. His body has been found, but his head has not. Shirley is found in the lake, tied down to some cinder blocks, presumably in the hopes that her body would never surface, but it did. On May 17th, 2014, investigators release the cause of death for Shirley, and it is blunt force trauma to the head. Now, I want you to stop for a second and think about what that means. We've got a situation where we know a knife was used because Russell's been decapitated, but Shirley is not stabbed. She is hit in the head. And that's how she's killed. This is interesting because it means there are at least two weapons involved in this case. Now, it is certainly possible that you have an intruder who has multiple tools to kill that they've brought with them. That happens. But one of the other places your mind automatically goes is two different perpetrators. One who has a knife, one who has, apparently, a hammer. In fact, Shirley had multiple head injuries that were inflicted by an object that essentially had a round surface that struck her head. That is most likely a hammer. A claw hammer is what is suspected. So just your standard sort of hammer you would use to nail a nail into the wall, that is what is suspected to have killed her. She was struck in the head at least twice with a hammer, and it was hard enough that it did cause fractures to her skull. There were no signs of sexual assault, and we know that she was dead when her body was placed in the water, which, you know, if you're looking for any kind of blessings in this case, at least they didn't throw her in the water weighted down while she was still alive. And they know that because there's no evidence of drowning, there's no water in her lungs, nothing like that. And the hammer blows would have been enough to kill her. Now, she had been in the water for quite some time, so there's not going to be anything like time of death. You're not going to be able to determine that. That is always a fraught thing, even when you have someone who is found very quickly. In a very ordinary circumstance, time of death is more of an art than a science, but you're certainly not going to have it in this case.
A few things strike me with her manner of death. The use of that hammer, first of all, it's very personal, because in order to be struck with a hammer, you have to be within arm's length of a person, probably less, because if you're thinking about kind of the lever of a hand, you're really within like an elbow's length away from the person. And the other thing is, when you hear blunt force trauma, many things could have caused that. If she stumbled upon, say, a robbery, they could have accidentally swung at her, or she could have fallen down. She is incredibly old, right? She's pretty frail compared to someone who could have the dexterity to, say, decapitate her husband. And so it wouldn't take something like a hammer to take her out. You could probably overcome her with your own hands. But they went the added step of a hammer. And because of the hammer, you don't typically rob a place with a hammer, right? Like, you don't typically see people like rob a bank, for example, saying, give me all your money, or sticking through their hoodie, I have a hammer. No, you usually carry a gun. And so what that tells me is the hammer was brought in order to inflict this blunt force trauma on someone, whether it was for Russell or Shirley. And that's really disturbing, again, because we've talked about who the Dermonds are. They're not people who you would expect to be targeted because they have people who hate them. And so to come with a device specifically to do this horrific thing meant to kill, you don't hit someone over the head once or twice with a hammer to incapacitate them. You do it to kill them and to make sure that they are dead, because that is an incredibly large object that is meant to crush the skull. And that just, the personal, the closeness of it, and also the intentionality is what jumps out at me as to her manner of death.
And look, I think you're right about that. And I think there's even more to it, because it feels like, given the preparation that the killer or killers undertook, the fact that they brought things with them that seem to have only one purpose, and that's to kill and conceal a body. And it makes you feel like this wasn't accidental. So you could imagine a circumstance in which, like you said, somebody spooks you. There's a hammer sitting on the table. You grab it, you swing around, and you hit them in the head, and then you hit them again, and then they're dead, and you didn't even mean to kill them, right? Like, you could imagine that happening, like in a robbery gone wrong. But here's something that I think is interesting. Now, we don't know everything about this case. You know, people always ask us questions about these open cases because your minds are running and you're thinking of facts and you're wanting to know details that a lot of times we don't know, because all we know is what either the police have told us, what has come out through sort of rumor, or what has slipped in the many interviews that have been done with people who are involved in this case. But one thing that seems to be clear, based on everyone's description of the scene, is there is no evidence that Shirley was killed in that home. Now, think about this. She is being struck in the head with a hammer. Not certain, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's blood involved. Ordinarily, as we've talked about a lot of times, being hit in the head, certainly in a way that is hard enough to fracture the skull, is probably going to also break the skin, and head wounds bleed a lot. There is no evidence that she was struck in the home. Now, maybe she was struck and it just didn't leave any evidence, and there's no evidence of a struggle because it happened so quickly. But it feels like this happened somewhere else, which means it most likely was intentional. It wasn't done accidentally because someone was spooked. Someone decided to take a hammer and use it to kill Shirley. And it was a hammer that apparently they brought with them. So that makes you feel like this was always the intended way they were going to murder this woman.
Yeah, absolutely. And if this happened somewhere other than the home, again, what we talked about with an 80-something-year-old woman, there are fortunately many ways to kill her that are much less gruesome. If you have already incapacitated her, you probably have her bound already to some degree. She can't get away. Suffocation is pretty quiet and not gruesome. This involves really taking the active action of being the one to end her life. And I say that obviously strangulation or suffocating someone is also that, but it's a kind of a one step removed in terms of what the perpetrator may be thinking. There's no question that your hand coming down is the one that ends her life. And so that intentionality goes to who we think the profile of the person is who committed this crime.
So obviously this was an all hands on deck case, and the Putnam County Sheriff's Department, unlike some law enforcement agencies you'll see, they accepted all the help they could get. They're working with the FBI, they're working with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, everybody to comb through the Dermond's life. Because as we've said, and you think about victimology, trying to figure out what was going on around someone's life right before they're killed, if it's not a random act of violence, then you would expect to see something that gives you some sign. They're going through years worth of phone records, bank records, looking for anything unusual, and they don't find a single thing that stands out to them. There are a lot of security cameras on the boat docks, on the gates, at the home. They had a security system. It was off at the time. The batteries were dead. You know, we talk about there have been other cases where home security systems and cameras have been a part of it and the batteries were dead. And people were like, that's so suspicious. How convenient. Reality is, if you have a camera system that requires batteries, they're going to work probably as long as the batteries do, and then you're going to forget to replace them. So this is just not that surprising. They check all these boat docks. Most of them are aimed at the dock, basically to make sure no one steals the boat. They're not looking out over the water in a way that would be helpful. The cameras on the gates at the gated part of the community didn't work. And as law enforcement is thinking more and more about Shirley and where her body was found, the fact that the Dermonds did not own a boat means whoever did that had to use their own boat. And it's unlikely that they would have taken her body or taken her in a vehicle, driven somewhere to a boat, taken the boat down the boat ramp, and then taken her body to dump it. The most likely, most logical thing is they arrived in a boat, they took her off in a boat, they dumped her, and then they left on one of those public boat ramps that we talked about. But looking at all the various things you could think of to try and pinpoint who this was, they all are just dead ends. None of them are giving them any information on the murders. They're either not working at the time of the murders or they just don't show anything. And there was nothing that anyone could identify in the couple's past that would have made them the target of this kind of crime. You know, there's no shady business deals with the mob, or they're secretly cocaine traffickers working with the Mexican cartel, or they're KGB agents who've been relocated to the United States. Like, there's no matter where your mind goes, there's just no evidence. They seem to just be 80-something-year-old grandparents retiring on the lake and the sunset of life, who all of a sudden are a target for an incredibly heinous crime.
And you've just said something, Brett, that I know a lot of people probably have been thinking about ever since the first episode when we mentioned that Russell was decapitated. The cartel, right? This seems like a targeted professional hit. And the cartel typically, it's not overkill, but it's like gruesome kills in order to send a message to those who are living, right? You leave with a head, or you put a head on a stake as if to say to everyone else, don't you mess with us. The problem with that is not only are there absolutely no indications that the cartel would have any reason to have any beef with the Dermonds, but when you send a message, people need to know what the message is. And it's not clear what the message would be here in the Dermonds case. And so while at first glance, you may think, wow, this seems like a professional hit. These people knew what they were doing. This is incredibly gruesome. It's so vicious. It sounds like the cartel. I agree. That was my first initial gut reaction. But the more I look at this, the less this looks like a cartel hit because of all the reasons we've talked about. And trust me, when they want to send a message, they will. And they don't want someone else taking credit for what they're doing. And so it absolutely would make sense if this were a message. but no one knows what the message is. And there is absolutely, again, no indication that they would come after these like 80-something-year-old people who spend their time golfing and doing crossword puzzles. And you'd have to have someone who wants you to be a target. Again, they are beloved. They're so beloved, in fact, that their neighbors are the ones who found them. These are not people who are loners. They're very enmeshed in their community. And when you're enmeshed in your community, people do pick up on things, especially when they're looking backwards, right? They always say hindsight is 20/20. They'll be like, well, Susie really did hate, the way the Dermonds treated her at the grocery store every week. Nothing like that has surfaced even after the fact.
And Alice is so right about this, because I don't care how idyllic your life is, if you were the victim of something like this, the second thing you're going to be victimized by are rumors. And everything you ever did, and every fight you ever had, and every time somebody got mad because you took their pew at the church is going to come up, and the police are going to hear about it. And the police in this case conducted hundreds of interviews. They talked to basically everybody who'd ever known the Dermonds, everybody in the area, everybody in the community, everybody who worked with them, everybody who even might have something against them. And what we are told is there was nothing in those interviews that led to even issues in their lives, much less a suspect. Tips were coming in, they had put out a reward, but they all were dead ends. But that's not to say that they weren't beginning to learn things. And some of the things they were learning were coming from the bodies themselves. Now, we talked about Shirley and her cause of death. Well, Russell, when the police found Russell's body, obviously he had been decapitated, but there was something strange about it. Yes, there was blood, and the towels had been set up to make sure that blood didn't leave the garage, but there was nowhere near as much blood as you would expect for a decapitation. Certainly, there wasn't the kind of arterial spray and gruesomeness. I mean, this was gruesome, but gruesomeness that you would see if someone had been decapitated while they were still alive. So initially, the police were thinking the decapitation was post-mortem. We don't know how Russell was killed, but we think it was post-mortem. And as they're looking at the body, things would seem to confirm that. One of the biggest ones was Russell's shirt had gunpowder on the collar. And this led to the conclusion, that obviously cannot be confirmed, that he was most likely shot, which adds yet another weapon to the mix. He was killed in a different manner than Shirley. Remember, she was hit in the head with a hammer. If they're right about this, he was shot, and you have the knife or whatever was used to remove Russell's head, all of which were brought to the crime scene. Now, as I said, it seems like he was decapitated after he was already dead. The cut to his neck was fairly clean. It's often described as very clean, like a very clean cut. But also, sometimes you hear people talking, particularly investigators, and they'll mention a saw. And I don't know if it's just they're being loose with language, or if they actually think that a saw was used to remove his head. If a saw was used, it's going to be somewhat clean, but obviously there's going to be a little bit more raggedness with a saw, I would expect, than a blade. Now, if a knife was used for a clean cut, it's probably a pretty big knife. I mean, this is a pretty big knife whoever brought would have used to do this, because a smaller knife, it's possible to decapitate someone with a smaller knife, but I don't think you're going to see a clean cut if you did that. And obviously the knife was very sharp if a knife was used.
Something that should probably be obvious to most people. I know we cover a lot of these types of cases and they're gruesome, but I've never decapitated someone, and I don't know the amount of force it would take. And so if I don't know the amount of force it would take, likely I would not use enough force. So this person who is leaving behind a relatively clean cut likely has some understanding of the force it would take in order to decapitate someone. I'm not saying that this person has decapitated someone before, but because this is an unsolved case, I'm trying to think of all the avenues of which to understand the perpetrator. We've talked about this in other cases before Delphi had the perpetrator caught and convicted. thank God. But we had talked about how that person likely knew the area. This person may have a lot of experience cutting meat and bone. Who would have that kind of experience? Someone who maybe hunts, right? It doesn't have to be a person that they're practicing on. And I note this because there's no hesitation. You got to go with it if this is what you're going to do. It takes a lot of force because we're not just talking about skin. We're talking about muscle, fat, bone. This is incredibly gruesome. But the fact that they've described it as a clean cut, however clean it is, I think the point of saying it's clean is to note that this is someone who kind of knows what they're doing, kind of know what is involved in order to have to carry out something so unusual. This is not like a skill that most people have, thank goodness. And so thinking about who this person is to be able to execute this and have at least the knowledge of how to do so in a way that does not look completely unprofessional, for lack of a better word.
And they knew they were going to do this, or at least they had a pretty good idea because they brought the materials to pull this off. You know, I mean, it wasn't just a pocket knife that they happened to have. They didn't grab a butcher's knife from the kitchen. Like, they brought a large knife or saw that could be used for this purpose. Now, here's one of the questions, though, that I think immediately springs to everybody's mind. Why? Why do you do this? There are a couple reasons you might do something like this. You see this sometimes with Jane Does that are found. You'll see Jane Does that are missing their hands and their head. And it's pretty obvious that whoever did that did it to prevent identification. Some of the genetic genealogy breakthroughs have been in cases like that. Obviously, we're not trying to prevent identification here. We all know who this is. It's going to be obvious to everyone, so that's not the reason. Some people have speculated that if they shot Russell, which it seems like they did, maybe they did this so that the bullet could not be traced. There were no shell casings found in the area. Now, the thing about that, though, if you're worried about the bullet being traced back to a gun, the easier thing to do is just to throw the gun in the lake. It's a much easier thing than removing someone's head to get a bullet, which, by the way, bullets are hard to trace anyway. So if that is the purpose, either they have some personal attachment to the gun, they really overthought this, or that's not why they did it in the first place.
That was my exact thought. We haven't talked about that particular fact, but I was like, man, that is really, really unnecessary. If all you're trying to do is to take the bullet with you, there's so many things you can do. You can get a quote unquote burner gun, just go get a gun that's kind of nondescript and then throw that gun away so it can't be traced to you, whatever, or what have you, steal a gun. I don't know. But clearly they had thought about it ahead of time. So it would be strange if what you're thinking about is, I want to make sure I leave behind no trace of the gun. I'll bring along a very large knife or saw to remove the body part in which I stick that bullet. Seems like if you had that much time to plan, that wouldn't be the first step. Although I agree, if there's no obvious reason why you would cut the head other than perhaps the bullet is there. That gunpowder residue gives us a lot of information, and this person, if they know, they seem to know things about saws and guns and decapitation, and if they know about guns, should know that gunpowder is another thing that a gun can leave behind in terms of not wanting to be traced or not wanting to know how Russell died. It seems like the head was taken because the person wanted to take the head, which is something that is difficult for a rational person to wrap their head around, but it may go to why this person killed in the first place.
Obviously, Russell's head has never been found, so it's difficult to confirm. Another thing that happens, though, that also feels like that was a lot of effort when you could have just done something much simpler. Remember the towels? So they set these towels up to prevent the blood from spreading. The towels are from a bathroom in the house. So they didn't bring the towels with them. They're from the house. Why not just move his body? His body is in front of the doors. So you're setting up the towels to prevent the blood from flowing underneath the doors. He's behind the cars. Literally, if you just took him to the front of the garage, you could do this, and the problem of having the blood flowing out through the garage doors would probably be taken care of. This makes me wonder a couple things. Number one, it seems like he was very clearly killed where he was found. But they didn't take him there. right? So he wasn't shot somewhere else and they took him there to do this whole decapitation thing. Because if they did that, they would be setting up the problem they then have to solve about the blood. But it also makes you wonder, we've been sort of suggesting there's more than one person involved here. But if there was only one, then moving Russell's body would have been really hard. So for instance, they're going to take, or he or whoever, somebody is taking Shirley with them. You know, if there were enough people there, they could have taken Russell's body, weighed it down, and dumped it too. Or they could have moved his body to somewhere in the basement or in the garage where this danger of the blood flowing out is less likely. But if there's only one person, moving his body might have been really difficult. This is a small thing, but it's just one of those things as you're thinking through, why did everything happen the way it did? Why is everything where it is? I think is at least something to consider. Now, another thing to think about, you know, there are a couple ways you could imagine this happening. Russell, he hears something. He walks out of his bedroom. You know, he's been asleep. Shirley's downstairs. He walks into the carport. Somebody behind him shoots him in the head. He falls down dead. He never knows it's happening. That is not what happened. Because, according to an article on 11 Alive, Russell's hands were bruised and pieces of Shirley's hair were actually interwoven in his wounds, which indicates that he may have been trying to fight off the attacker to protect his wife when he was killed. So he does have defensive wounds. It seems like he was at least near Shirley at some point. So this did become a bit of a struggle. It seems like in that carport garage area is where this went down. At some point he was shot, and then the attackers had to do the rest. And this may also be an indication that whatever was planned here did go wrong. So they had a plan. They were prepared for a lot of different things, but it did not go exactly the way they expected because they did have this confrontation with Russell. This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states. Guys, it's been the holidays, and it's wonderful. We all love it. But when it's over, you can feel a little depleted. You can look a little depleted too. Maybe you gained some weight you didn't want to gain. Maybe you're just not feeling as well as you did before, and you're thinking about, how am I going to turn things around? I need to jumpstart my new year. Well, I want to talk to you now about Prolon. You've heard us talk about it before. It is the 5-day fasting program that is so amazing and so energizing and can really kickstart your year. Prolon works at the cellular level to rejuvenate you from the inside out. It supports enhanced skin appearance and fat loss, improves energy and focus. It takes the guesswork out, and it equips you with a science-backed plan, making it a great way to kick off your 2025 health journey. And I say it's a fasting plan. And it is, but it's really a fasting mimicking diet. It's revolutionary, it's plant-based, it's a nutrition program that nourishes the body while making cells believe they're fasting. And that's the most important thing. When I got into this, I thought to myself, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can do a 5-day fast. I'd done some of the fads before. I'd never done anything science-based. And then all of a sudden, I had this program where I wasn't totally fasting, where I was eating soups and I was having snacks and I was having drinks. And I never really felt like I was fasting altogether. And by the end of it, I felt so much better. And there's a reason for that. This was researched and developed for decades at USC's Longevity Institute and backed by leading U.S. medical centers. And it will promote healthy blood sugar, enhanced skin appearance, fat loss, and improved energy and focus. You need to check this out, and now is the time to do it. Just in time for the new year, Prolon is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off their 5-day nutrition program for your post-holiday glow-up when you go to prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLON life.com/prosecutors for 15% off. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
Prosecutors. You won't regret it. Guys, if you're like me, it feels like you spend half your life trying to figure out what you're going to eat. Where are you going to get it? What are you going to make? And how are you going to find something that everybody likes? Well, I want to talk to you today about one of our newest sponsors, Cook Unity. You can reset your routine with Cook Unity for an endless variety of vibrant, healthy meals made by award-winning chefs. It is easy to find dishes that align with your goals, and you can enjoy a variety that keeps every meal exciting and satisfying. It's easy and effortless. You can choose from hundreds of meals prepared by award-winning chefs, and they can be ready to eat in as little as 5 minutes, and we're talking about as low as $11 per meal. And this is good food. Their roster of all-star chefs includes Food Network alums, James Beard Award winners, and acclaimed restaurateurs balancing flavor and nutrition in small batch meals. I know I tried the pan-seared Cajun salmon. It was incredible. And you know, you don't often get fish that's really good and really vibrant, but this was. But if you're more into the beef, try the beef tinga tacos. You will not go wrong with those. And how do they do it? The people who are making these are the chefs you see on TV in five-star kitchens. They are the chefs who craft each small batch meal with you in mind. Made from local, in-season ingredients, sent fresh, not frozen, and delivered directly to your door, all at a fraction of the cost and time. You can take part of this as well. Reset your routine with convenient, mouth-watering meals crafted with local ingredients by award-winning chefs. Go to cookunity.com/prosecutors or enter prosecutors before checkout for 50% off your first week. That's 50% off your first week by using code prosecutors or going to cookunity.com/prosecutors. Check it out. You won't regret it.
And that's just such a sad fact. Clearly, there was some sort of altercation because of the bruised hands, and he, by all accounts, seems to have been trying to protect his wife. What's really interesting here, of course, is he was close enough to his wife to have her hair in his wounds, yet whatever happened, it seems like they had come prepared to kill Russell, whether or not they prepared to kill him there at that point in time or not. But why not go ahead and kill both of them at the same time? Why seemingly have Shirley still be alive and taken away? And I say that because if they had both been killed at the same time, we likely would have seen both of their blood there, but we don't have Shirley's DNA there. So that is very interesting because even though something went wrong, according to the perpetrator's plan, they still maybe all along intended to take Shirley away, to kidnap her first, and then to kill her eventually. So it seems like, based on the order of events that we're seeing unfold through these wounds, Shirley may have been the target. Or at least Shirley, there was some reason for Shirley to be the one taken away, and probably taken away alive. But we've already noted kind of the most obvious reason women are kidnapped. There was no sexual assault on her. And that is incredibly interesting. Maybe it got thwarted. But again, this was a very long crime in terms of the timeline. She was left alive after there was some cover up and decapitation of her husband, carried away, weighted down, hammered in the head twice, then thrown overboard, 15 minutes away boat ride from her home. So if they had wanted to do something else to her, they had the time to do it. They just didn't. And now this brings us to May 2015. Sheriff Howard Sills revealed that they did have a person of interest in the case. Now, he did not give much information other than say that it was someone they had interviewed before who made statements that were not completely truthful. That doesn't give us a lot of information. It sounds more like maybe they were going back over their files and noticed inconsistencies in a statement rather than something they found at the scene of the crime that ties them to someone. But it is someone known to the police who they have already spoken with. And what that indicates, of course, is that there's not enough information to make an arrest. So it could be we think something's there, but more investigation needs to happen. Now, around the same time, it was revealed that a man was seen walking on the Dermonds' property around the time of when we think the murders happened. Now, authorities reportedly identified and interviewed this man, but no arrest was made, and it's not clear if the person of interest they noted that they had is the same as the person who was seen walking on the property. And then that's it. Nothing happens in this case for about a decade. In April or May of 2024, last year, if we're listening to this in January, Sheriff Sills confirmed to WSB-TV2 that he obtained a piece of clothing that belonged to Russell Dermond that did have DNA from an unknown individual on it. And the evidence had been sent to our friends at Othram Labs for further testing. So this is a big deal because we had talked about how the perpetrators had been pretty careful and seemingly left very little behind, but they did have DNA. And Othram was able to find the DNA, and they recommended the evidence be sent to Sorensen Forensics in Utah, who also found DNA. Now, the reason these labs are sending DNA around is very important. So we know that technology, especially in the DNA space, is rapidly changing. Every day there are new advances. There are things that we can do today we couldn't do yesterday. There are things we can do today we couldn't do a decade ago. But it's still not a magic button. Just because they have found the presence of DNA may not necessarily mean they can do anything with it now. And so Othram Labs has been pretty vocal. They've been on our show before. They're pretty vocal about the fact that the most important thing for them is not to use up DNA if they don't think with a very high level of certainty that they're able to get something usable out of it. Because every time you test DNA, you use it up and then it's gone forever, and you can't take advantage of advancements in DNA testing in the future. And so they're sending it elsewhere for confirmation. You know, the easiest thing to do if you were just a business was just to keep it and run the sample and take all the glory for yourself. But the reason it's going to multiple places is likely this is like very trace amounts of DNA, and they want to make sure that what they are seeing can be confirmed by someone else. Now, Sheriff Sills confirmed that they're looking for additional DNA to run it through the national database or through genealogical data to identify a suspect. In other words, there's DNA, but there's more you can do with it. They may not be able to, say, have a profile of the DNA today, but perhaps they can find another DNA and be able to match against it and see what they have now. All to say is there is DNA, but I don't know that we have enough to definitively understand who that DNA belongs to just yet. Now, this wasn't it, though. The police also confirmed that they had new leads deriving from cellular data. They said, we have utilized different techniques and different methods of analyzing cellular data, different devices that may have been in the area during the murder and after the fact. This is really interesting because obviously this is coming like a decade after the murders. Why is that? Well, just like cell phone analysis, we've had cell phone analysis experts on our other show, Legal Briefs. You should go listen to it. That's also not something very clear cut where the cell phone company just prints out a list of like suspects for you. Like AT&T doesn't just say, hey, these were people at the Dermond's house. They probably are suspects for you. Rather, it's kind of a complex puzzle where you are doing methods of elimination and creating basically different puzzles that never existed before to try and see if you can tease out something from the cell phone data. And cell phone data analysis has gotten more advanced as well in those years. Now, at the same time, the FBI increased the reward from $5,000 to $20,000 in order to solve this case, which may indicate that they have information, they have new leads, but they also know someone probably knows something, and that person needs to come forward in order for them to connect all those dots to make an arrest. And in addition to that $20,000, the Putnam County Sheriff's Office is also offering a $5,000 reward on top of it. So in other words, if you have information, you could stand to gain $25,000 if it leads to an arrest in this case.
And one thing that's exciting about all this is this all happened in 2024. So this case is 10 years old, but it seems like there's some breaking stuff happening right now. And the DNA stuff Othram is right on the cutting edge. It seems like they found some DNA that you just wouldn't have been able to find before. But it also seems like with the current technology, they are not certain they can get a result. And if there's one thing they have said to us repeatedly, it's they will not test the DNA unless they are as certain as you can scientifically be, which is never 100%, but as close to 100% as you can get, that they are going to solve this case. Because I think there is very little DNA, and they know this is a one-shot thing. And when they take that shot, they want to make sure they get something. Now, we don't know for certain. It's the killers. You never do. This is touch DNA. It could have been from the cucumber he bought at Publix, right? But this is heartening that maybe they'll be able to find something out soon. So a few things that are interesting about this case. We've touched on some of this. As we said, Russell's head was never found, and the police searched hard for it. They were using cadaver dogs to search the area. They drugged the lake around the house. They recovered a lawn chair and a Christmas tree, but that is it. And they searched the rest of the lake using some pretty advanced sonar the GBI had that they felt pretty confident would have found something, but they didn't find anything. Now, I'll say this. I'm glad they used it, and they might have found something, but the fact that they didn't find anything doesn't tell me the head is not in the lake, for instance. Like, we know these people brought, seems like it was nets that held the weights. That's another thing that I've never seen officially released, but I've heard people mention netting was what held the weight. So it seems like they brought that as well. They brought at least 2 weights. They certainly could have brought 3. And if they weighed down the head, that is not going to float to the surface the way a body would. So it could very well be there, or could have been taken away. In any event, they have never found it. Now, one thing that some people have focused on that I think is completely irrelevant, but for the sake of completeness, we'll talk about it. In 2000, so 14 years before this happened, Russell and Shirley's eldest son was murdered while buying drugs in Atlanta. Pretty straightforward drug murder. He was buying drugs from a dealer. The dealer tried to rob him. He fought back. He was killed. His killer was very quickly arrested and convicted of the murder, and he was in prison at the time of Shirley and Russell's murder. Now, of course, some people speculate that there's a connection there, but Russell and Shirley, number one, weren't very close to their son at the time of the murder. You know, he was struggling with these addiction issues. They did not attend the trial, so this is not some sort of big vendetta between them and the dealer. He went to prison, and I'll just tell you, this wasn't a drug murder. Like that in the real world, we have dealt with dealers, violent people a lot. That's not how this would go down. I mean, I've had defendants who have tried to have people killed before, and it wasn't me, and it wasn't, the victims or even the witnesses. It was like the guy who turned on them. Like, that is somebody that they might go after. They're not going after the elderly parents of somebody who was killed 14 years before. That's just not happening. So I think we can rule this out. The police certainly have, but it is something, as I said, it is literally the only thing in these people's entire lives that anybody can point to as a possible reason for a murder. Okay, so as we've said, aside from jokers like us speculating about this case, there's really not a solid theory about what happened. Sheriff Sills, who is very committed to solving this case, initially he thought it was potentially some sort of botched robbery or an extortion where the Dermonds were killed when they couldn't provide the money that was demanded. The problem with that is, as we've said, no signs of forced entry. The house was immaculate. Nothing was taken. Not even anything small. Like, think back to the Corpsewood Manors murder that we covered. You know, that was a case where some people decided they were going to rob some guys that they thought had a bunch of money. They get into the house. Turns out they don't have a bunch of money. Well, they still stole some stuff, right? It was stupid stuff, but they stole some stuff to try and at least recoup something from the robbery. You don't see that here. You got no signs of forced entry. Nothing's missing. You know, and it is a grand house, but it's not like it's the biggest house in the lake, and they're by far not the most wealthy people who live on the lake, and they're far more expensive houses. So it's not even somebody just always saw that beautiful, like there's one lake that I know of that has like a little island in the middle of it, and there's like a mansion on it, and it's obviously the most opulent house on that lake. If you're going to rob a house on the lake, that's the one you'd rob. That was not the situation here. So it doesn't even feel like it would be a random robbery. Now, as we've said, a really important piece of information in this case is the killer would have had to have access to a boat, whether they drove to a boat or they used a boat to get there. Her body was dumped in pretty much the deepest part of the lake, which absolutely would have required a boat to access, and in fact would have been about a 15-minute boat ride from their dock. But they didn't own a boat, so it wasn't stolen from them, though they did have access to the lake. Now, I think this probably means that the killer approached by boat, and this could have gone unnoticed, though we talked about boats are loud. But nevertheless, this house is on sort of a secluded corner of a cul-de-sac, and there's no indication that anyone came through the guardhouse at the main entrance of the community. And of course, there's no guardhouse preventing you from using one of those public boat ramps we talked about before to gain access to the lake.
So this particular fact is really chilling to me because while it's possible the person could have rented a boat, I don't know that how careful they are. That would be the necessarily way they would dispose of a body if they didn't have a boat themselves, because we obviously know that those types of records are traceable. And so like eventually there's only so many marinas on a lake you could rent a boat from. And police can go through those records and kind of see who rented a boat around this time period. You have to give an ID, for example, because you can't just drive a boat. You have to have a boating license. And so that leaves behind a record that could narrow the pool of suspects, which leads me to believe that the boat that was used likely was not rented, but belonged to or was borrowed by the person or persons who committed this crime. And why this is chilling to me is while maybe they drove cross country with a boat that they owned to commit this crime, more likely they live in this area and have a boat. That's chilling to me because this is what we talked about, an idyllic neighborhood where it's very small population wise and it's idyllic and the neighbors all know each other. And what we said, there was 20,000 people in the town and you have to have a lot of means really to live on this lake. And so the possibility that this was committed by someone who is from this area, I don't know, it turns my blood cold because again, the Dermonds are not people who are hated in this town. They're loved in this town. So this could have been carried out by someone who knew them and they liked. And the fact that there's no forced entry, I think tends to lean towards the fact that they thought this was someone they knew or liked and would open a door to. Just get so carried away with my thoughts. I'm so sorry.
That's the whole point of the podcast.
And I'm not the only one who thinks that, because the authorities believe that the killer was likely someone who did know the Dermonds or at least had some level of familiarity with their home, and that this crime was likely personal for a lot of the reasons we've already talked about. Local police and the FBI have also disclosed that it's possible, perhaps even likely, that there was more than one killer. Now, it's been reported that the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit provided the following description of the perpetrator. It's likely a male due to the physical strength required to carry out the crime and is likely someone who likes guns and knives or has familiarity with them. And we know that's not exactly groundbreaking because of the way the crime was committed. Now, a lot of you in the chat have already said this since the first episode. You've speculated that perhaps these are the Dermonds' children who are involved because there's some sort of inheritance angle. While, of course, they were on a suspect list pretty early on, just because if you have a motive, the police are going to investigate it, but they've all been cleared. All of the 3 surviving children lived outside of the immediate areas and had alibis, and they all took polygraph tests voluntarily, and they passed them. And this crime really doesn't make sense from an inheritance angle because the business had already been turned over to them. And if they were waiting to get some sort of large sum when their parents passed away, they were in their mid-80s. It wasn't going to be much longer. There's no indication that the 3 children had maybe, pressing money troubles where they needed the inheritance right away. And again, there are ways to commit that type of crime much less gruesomely. And why would you want to take your mom away, fully conscious, knowing what's going on, and kill her elsewhere? Why not do it in their sleep at night when they won't know what's happening? And that's all that's required. All that's required is for them to be dead for the inheritance to pass on. This crime was something much more than just wanting them dead. there was something that I don't quite understand, but it's not just simply wanting to end Shirley and Russell's lives. And when you have the profile of the person being someone who likely knew the Dermonds and had familiarity with the home, I feel like that also cuts against that eldest son who was murdered back in 2000. Because remember, the Dermonds didn't move to this house or even to this area until 2000. And so it's unlikely that this was not a childhood home, for example, where the son who was wrapped up in kind of the drug world had friends who hung out at their home. He was really out of their lives by the time the Dermonds moved to Lake Oconee. And it's unlikely that his group of friends would have known the Dermonds' life in Oconee because of how estranged they were at that time. And so this may have been someone that they knew just around in town. And because they're retired, their adult children didn't live with them. So again, this is not one of those situations where maybe it's a friend of one of their children, because this is their sole home. They're empty nesters. They didn't have like children living in their basement who were ne'er-do-wells. That wasn't the case with their adult children. And of course, there's always the scary possibility that this was just a random act of violence or even a serial killer. But while this is a theory that sounds really interesting, it's not likely since there was no forced entry here. The lack of forced entry, I think, says a lot about who may have been the perpetrator, and I think it points to someone that at least Shirley knew. We'll talk more about our theories, but I do think Shirley may have been awake when perhaps Russell was still asleep.
Guys, we want to talk about a podcast that we are so honored to have been a part of on multiple occasions, Silver Linings Handbook with Jason Blair. If you guys have listened to our episodes, we talk about so many things. And the thing about Jason is he is so good at interviewing. He is able to pull out thoughts and entire conversations that you didn't even know you had in you. And he does that not only when it comes to true crime and not only when it's with us, but with so many people from so many different walks of life. Areas of focus have included well-being, mental health, the law and criminal justice system, true crime, religion, society and culture, and people who are underrepresented in the mainstream media. And Jason is a former journalist who worked at the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and other newspapers, and you will see it. He is a journalist at heart, and he has never lost that urge to find interesting things and to find the truth. What we feel makes the podcast difference is that it is truly not scripted. I can promise you that, having appeared on his show multiple times. Basically, we never talk about the things we're going to talk about. It is not scripted at all. And he uses the same natural curiosity you would have sitting in the living room, and his focus is on making a difference.
It's so true. I really love this podcast because no matter if you've heard this person speak before, Jason somehow is able to put everyone at ease and share some of their deepest, most inner thoughts. And you walk away learning more, not only about the interviewee, about Jason, but about yourself and humanity. This podcast focuses on the big cases like the murder of Gabby Petito and the disappearance of Maura Murray and Brianna Maitland through interviews with their loved ones. But this year, Jason has also had a particular focus on Indigenous people, including the missing and murdered Indigenous women, violence against Natives, and difficulties on reservations, a topic that you know is near and dear to the prosecutor's heart. And we love that Jason has also put a particular focus on this vulnerable population. But Jason also looks at the bright side. In 2 upcoming episodes, Jason will take you to Alaska, where Indigenous communities have partnered with state and local officials to address the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis and to preserve Native culture and their way of life. There is so much to be gleaned from this incredible podcast. Listen, you will not regret it. To subscribe, just go wherever you listen to your podcast and subscribe today. Silver Linings Handbook. Homes.com knows when it comes to home shopping, it's never just about the house or condo. It's about the home. And what makes a home is more than just the house or property. It's the location and neighborhood. If you have kids, it's also schools, nearby parks, and transportation options. That's why Homes.com goes above and beyond to bring home shoppers the in-depth information they need to find the right home.
And when I say in-depth, I'm talking deep. Each listing features comprehensive information about the neighborhood, complete with a video guide. They also have details about local schools with test scores, state rankings, and student-to-teacher ratio. They even have an agent directory with the sales history of each agent. So, when it comes to finding a home, not just a house, this is everything you need to know all in one place. Homes.com. We've done your homework.
No, I agree. And I think, really, that's all there is in this case. There's just, there's not a lot of evidence. There's a lot of really strange, bizarre things about this case. Things that your mind can just go running with possibilities of what happened here. But we've come to the conclusion of the evidence. So now, I guess we'll get into some theories. Alice, do you think maybe it was a mob hit?
So I kind of already talked about that earlier with the cartel. I think you have to explore that option because of the fact that Russell was decapitated and that you have weighted cinder blocks. This is the way they were killed and concealed really seems like out of a movie. Seems like it's out of a mob movie. But when you dig a little bit deeper, it really doesn't have the underpinnings of a typical mob or cartel type of hit. So while I think it's worth exploring, other than the fact that Russell's decapitated and cinder blocks are weighing down Shirley, nothing else really indicates the mob did this. And again, the mob lets people know what they do. And we've also talked about how when, one additional person knows about a crime, it's really hard to keep that a secret. You know what happens in a mob? Lots of people know about lots of different things, and there are lots of rumors. And you know what else happens in a mob? A lot of people are running from the law. And what do they typically do when they were trying to look for a break or get themselves a better deal? Give up all the information they know, even if it's just hearsay, even if it's just rumor. And so the fact that we haven't heard anything about this coming from the mob, there's no indication that there's any ties of a mob or the cartel to the Dermonds, and it's not even clear why they would target the Dermonds, for me, means that the mob hit angle is an unlikely theory.
And I think you're right about that. And the sheriffs talked about how this would be such what he called a ticket. It's like a big ticket. If you get arrested for something else and you can throw down, I got information on this murder, it would be worth a ton. And yet nobody they've arrested has ever said, hey, I heard this was a hit by, such and such. And it is like a movie. And I think that's why people naturally gravitate to it first. And I think it's something you always have to discuss. But things don't actually tend to happen like they do in the movies. I feel like if this was actually a hit, they'd have walked in, shot them both, and left. If that was what they were trying to do, they wouldn't have done all this other stuff. It does remind me, talking about movies, if you've ever seen Hostel 2, this happens at the beginning of Hostel 2. There's a guy who has some information. He's hiding out in the middle of nowhere. And one morning his girlfriend wakes up and all she finds is his body, and he's been decapitated because they took the head to the head of the guy who's running sort of the cartel to prove that he has been killed. Right? So your mind immediately goes to that. That's what they're doing. There are easier ways to do that. You could just take a Polaroid of him. You could cut off his finger. Taking his head seems like a pretty gruesome and really dangerous way, because that means you got to carry this head around with you everywhere you go. The fact that you do this, it is strange. And I just don't think in this circumstance, if you'd found his body on the Mexican border right across the Rio Grande and it turned out, he was selling cocaine. Okay. He was the mob. That's who did it. It was the cartel. That's not here. It's not a mob hit. We can cross that out.
And this goes back to the one or two or multiple perpetrator thing. This is really gruesome too, but a head's really bulky and heavy. And so if you're carrying out an 80-something-year-old woman who is going against her will, one person, I guess, could maybe throw her over their shoulder and carry a head, but likely it's more than one person. Or they made multiple trips, and they're making multiple trips in open field to the boat in the dock in a cul-de-sac where people can see. That's really risky too. Why not just leave with the thing you want, seemingly surely, Why go back for the head? I don't know. And so that kind of points to multiple people for me, or at least something very calculated about it, because going back for the head or taking the head, period, exposes so much risk to the person or persons who are doing this.
Now, I do want to say sort of one angle on the mob hit that I think you have to at least mention is it's a mistake. So they were going to murder someone and do all the things they did, but it wasn't supposed to be them. It was supposed to be somebody else. And, we've been assuming this person must have been really familiar with the lake, because to find a house, a specific house on the lake at night is really hard. It is really hard if you are living there and you go out boating and it's gotten dark and you're trying to find your way back. It's hard to find your own house. So maybe they went to the wrong house, busted in, killed him, decapitated him, took the head back to the cartel head. And he's like, nope, this is why I make you guys take the head, because half the time you get it wrong, right? I mean, that's essentially what he'd be saying. The problem with that is, once again, I don't think you would do it this way if it was a mob hit, first thing. And second thing, the police, it wasn't just the Dermonds that the police were looking into. They were looking at the neighbors. They were looking at the other people on the lake. I feel like if there was someone on that lake who was doing the kind of things that would make them the target of this kind of attack, they would have heard about it. They would have heard rumors about it. Something would have come up. Someone would have said, I bet they were trying to get the Johnsons. Everybody knows they're doing shady stuff. And there's just not been anything like that. So I just, this whole crime to me feels messy in a way that I don't think, it's both well planned and messy. And I just don't think it's going to be a mob hit. And I also don't think it's a random robbery, which is another possibility. As we said, you're sort of boating around, you see a house, you're like, let's go rob those people. I don't think so. I mean, number one, random robbers don't tend to do it like this. I'm not going to say they never have, but going in with this kind of intentionality to murder people and dispose of them in the lake and then forget to steal anything. Didn't take the Rolex. Didn't take anything from this house. Nothing of value. It just feels strange. Now, one possibility is this is a little bit more sophisticated robbery. It's a robbery where the person has a specific thing they want, and they're going in to get that, and for whatever reason they didn't get it. Maybe they thought there was a safe with $1 million in there, or maybe they thought, they could kidnap somebody for extortion, and it went a little sideways. There was no safe. There was no money. The kidnapping didn't work out. Somebody got killed, and they decided to be smart thieves, because a smart thief in this circumstance, if they didn't get what they wanted, they wouldn't take anything, because the best way to get caught is to steal something and then try and sell it, right? Like, that is what a bad thief does. So maybe they're so sophisticated that they decided, well, it's too bad we've had to kill two people, but we're not going to get anything out of this. We're going to go our separate ways. Maybe, but still, that feels like more of a possibility than a random robbery. But I think we can pretty much say random robbery did not happen.
And another theory that's along those lines is that it's a random act of violence. Kind of for the same reasons that Brett just said, it seems unlikely this is a random act of violence, because you'd have to get in a boat, probably in the middle of the night, and just roll up to a dock and hope that the person will open the door to you because there's no forced entry, and then decide to carry out this random act of violence. It's a lot of effort for a random act of violence. Random acts of violence typically happen like in a crowded urban area. You're like, I just am breaking into this house. It takes a lot of effort to decide to break into this house and kill these two old people in this very complicated, involved manner. And for what it's worth, the sheriff thinks whoever did this is long gone by now.
Yeah, and I actually disagree with the sheriff. I mean, I hate to disagree with the sheriff who's been working on this for 10 years, but I actually think he's wrong, because I don't think it was a random act of violence. I think it's probably somebody who knew them in some form or fashion. And I think that probably means someone who either lives in that community or has lived in that community or is very familiar with that community. Either someone who lives there, the child of someone who lives there, the grandkids of someone who lives there, someone who lives in the town nearby and doesn't live in that community but wishes they did, but has boated in that community a lot of times. Somebody who knows the Dermonds even if they don't know them. someone who is familiar with them, who has met them, who has talked to them, who has heard rumors about their wealth, something along those lines. I feel like when you look at sort of all the things about this case, the fact that they knew where they were, the fact that it feels so targeted, like this feels targeted in a very specific way, the way they treated her, the way they treated him. It seems like they went in there with an intention. Now, it could have just been to commit violence. It could have just been they're angry at the world, or they're angry at them, or they're angry at their own grandparents and they can't do anything about that, but they can attack them, or it's some sort of weird obsession, or the Dermonds offended them in some way that you would never know, but they have something wrong in their head where that offense was enough. I'm going to kill that person. Right? It's hard to say exactly without knowing who this is, but this whole thing and everything you see makes it feel like this is someone who knew them in some form or fashion.
And the intentionality behind all of this crime, I think, leads me to believe what you just said, that this is someone they knew, because we've talked a lot about this boating, but let's break it down really quick for those who may not know much about boating. Boating is loud, it takes effort, and it's hard to navigate a lake because there's not road signs, especially at night. Likely, many of the lights that usually are on during the day are off because they don't need to be on. This is not a highway where people are traveling, so the lake doesn't have to be well lit at night. And certainly, if you yourself don't have a boat like the Dermonds didn't, there's no reason to leave on the lights on your dock. So likely it was pitch black. They're having to navigate it. They must know this area so well that they know which dock to pull up to. Difficult to do, unnoticed, because of the sound of the motor, and as well as the fact that houses look different from the back than the front. This house, if you look it up online, probably you see the front of it. But the back view of it facing the lake is going to look different, as well as the fact that you can't just jump out of your boat and start running towards the house. You need your boat to get away. You know what you need to do? You need to tie your boat up. So what that means is no matter how fast you're going, and likely if you're trying to evade detection, especially in a cove, you're going to go slow. Why? Because if you go even above basically swimming speed, you're going to create waves. Waves cause other boats to push up against their docks and cause a banging noise, and it just creates more reason for people to look out the window for you. So likely you're doing a no-wake type of boating. So you're no-waking across this area, going very slow, and then even if you're going slow, you have to slow down even more in order to dock your boat correctly without running into it, causing more of a disruption, or hurting your boat or hurting the dock. And then you have to jump out and you have to tie your boat to the dock. And usually you tie it in more than one place because a boat floats. Usually tied in the front and in the back. All things that take time, having you exposed on an open dock for all to see. And then you turn around and walk up to the house to commit your crime. And then in the heat of whatever you've done, you're taking a head, you're taking an old lady, and you're throwing them in your boat. You still have to untie your boat, push off the dock, probably no wake out of there, and then hit your high speed and drive 15 minutes away. That level of intentionality just to involve the boat makes me really veer away from that random act of violence. And that's why I really don't think this is a random act of violence or a mistake even, because they had to know how to approach this dock. They may have been scoping this out for a while. And remember, one of the things from this year that the police said they have a new lead on, not just the DNA, but they said there was new cell phone analysis. Now, this confuses me a little bit because likely they already knew all the phones that were in the area. They said something kind of vague, like there's a new way of analyzing to see which phones were there. I wonder if it's not so much a cell phone dump where it's like, oh, well, previously we had these 40 numbers who were in the area. Now let's just go through them again. Rather, I wonder if it's something more like maybe they've made an arrest in another case and they got access to someone's phone and they noticed that that person has lots of pictures of the Dermond's house, for example. Or they, for some reason, had a Google search history and it showed up that they kept looking up things about the Dermond's house or the dock or whatever, something that just seemed strange. I wonder if it's more that they've gained information that they didn't previously have, rather than they're going back to analyze a cell phone dump or a geofence warrant. Otherwise, I don't understand how the cell phone analysis is new here. But all of these things indicate to me that this is done by someone who is familiar with them. But even with that, we have so many unanswered questions.
Yeah, we really do. And I think just to run through some of them, I mean, jumping on what Alice was saying, when exactly did this happen? Now, we know they didn't go to the Derby party, so it happened before the Derby. But I think it happened probably the night before, if I had to guess. I think this probably happened Friday night. I think it was at night, but I actually don't think it was that late because of what Alice is saying, at least when they arrived. Because I feel like the most inconspicuous way to do this is actually to do it the most normal way, to just sort of like go up, show up at the dock. Now, imagine a situation in which these people do know them, even if it's like not that great, and they're an older, very friendly couple. I remember once I was driving down the road. I was going too fast. I was in high school. I was going too fast. Cop passes me going the other way. He turns on his lights. I go over a hill and I'm like, well, am I going to stop for this cop? No. So I turned down a side road, right? And as I'm going down the side road, I realize one of my friends lives on this road. I've never been to her house, but I know where it is. I don't know how I knew where it was, but I knew where it was. So I pulled into her driveway and I got out of the car and I went up to the front door and rang the doorbell. And her mom comes to the front door. She's never met me before. She doesn't know who I am. Her daughter is not there. And I was just like, hey, is your daughter around? And she's like, no. And I was like, oh. And she's like, why don't you come in? And so I went in and like had a Coke while the police were looking for me, presumably. And then was like, all right, see you later. I got back in my car and left. Like, that's what people do, right? So you could imagine a situation in which these people sort of kind of barely know them, show up at the dock, and Shirley, not thinking anything of it, lets them in. Or is being nice, or offers to, maybe they say, hey, we're having a little bit of boating trouble. We're having a little trouble with the boat. Do you care if we use your phone? We're on the lake. We don't have cell phone service, right? Anything like that. And maybe Russell was already in bed and she's downstairs and he hears this, and that's why he gets out and he goes downstairs, and that's why the bed's unmade, and that's why he's in his bedclothes. It's hard to say. We actually don't know what Shirley was wearing. I've never seen that. I've never seen a description of what she was wearing when she was found. But that's just, if you think about when did it happen, I think it also affects how it happened.
No, I think you're really honing in on kind of what may have happened here. And I think it may be possible that it's even more attenuated than, oh, I know your son or something like that. It could be as simple as, I go to your church. We know that they were really involved in their community church and they were a friendly couple in town. Like, they may just even know, but this also goes towards the planning and the targeting of the Dermonds. They may know what the Dermonds are involved in and know the right things in order to gain that level of familiarity. Like, hey, weren't you involved in the choir at, so-and-so community church? My mom sings with you. Something like that, even if it's not true, which may indicate why it's been so hard to track them down, because the Dermonds may have had enough familiarity to say, yeah, come on in, sweetheart. Let me grab the phone for you so you can call your mom to come get you because your boat broke down. But they're not actually known to them because this was all fabricated, because they knew enough about the Dermonds in order to say the right things to create that level of familiarity.
And I think the other thing that raises, the other issue it raises, is who was the target? Were they both the target? Was this a targeted murder, or was it something else? Were they trying to get Shirley away? Because, if you're thinking sort of through this, if it's not just they are going there to murder these two people for whatever reasons that we can't even really fathom and that we'll only know if we find these people. Kind of like, I keep going back to the Corpsewood murders. If those guys had been a little bit more thoughtful in the way they committed that crime. Like, for instance, don't bring two random people to the murder. If they had gone in and murdered those guys and gone back to their lives and not really left any evidence behind, we would wonder, why did this happen? Was this a robbery? Was it, we would never know about the personal interactions between the murderers and the two men who lived in that house, right? We wouldn't know that. We would think it was just a robbery. Similarly here, until we find out who did it, we probably won't know exactly what happened, right? But if you're thinking, is this more monetary, then one thing you could easily imagine is this is intended to be some sort of ransom thing. And the idea is they were going to kidnap Shirley, take her out on the lake, murder her, dump the body, and then act like she was alive and seek a ransom. A lot of times, people who are kidnapped for ransom are killed immediately. That's one reason people always want proof of life or whatever. that could have been what they were trying to do, and they interrupted, and it didn't work out. They went ahead and killed her, but they decided not to seek the ransom because things had just gotten too crazy. But we don't know that, right? We don't, I think initially, if you're thinking the whole mob hit thing, you think Russell is the target. He is the reason they're there. They killed him the way they did because of that. But if you're thinking it's something else, then maybe Shirley's the target and he's actually collateral damage.
Yeah, and the ransom angle, while interesting at first, is less interesting because both of them are dead. You need someone to demand the ransom from, right? And so the money, like we said, is mostly with them, and it's not clear that they were going to reach out, say, to one of the kids who live out of the area. They're not even close by. You would think you want to leave the husband alive, so you have someone to demand the ransom from who has immediate access to their bank account, for example, rather than, these kids who maybe have to wait for an inheritance before they can turn over the money that is being demanded. So the ransom is really would be a bizarre way to go about it. And there's no indication they didn't leave any notes behind, for example. There was no attempt at even requesting a ransom. And she was found 10 days later. Now, one thing, because this case is so mind-boggling and there are so many just unanswered questions in terms of why so many weapons are used, why are they killed in different manners, why the attempts to conceal but then not really to conceal, why the gun and then the saw or the knife and then a hammer and then the boat, all these different elements. I do think this was very planned. I do think the Dermonds were the targets for it. The question that I don't know the answer to is why. And one possibility that just throwing out there, because I think you have to think of all angles in order to try and think outside of the box, especially when we seem to be in a year in which this case probably can be solved if someone comes forward with more information, is I wonder if the person they're looking for has essentially deeply troubled issues, and the Dermonds weren't really the targets per se. They were stand-ins for the targets. There's this psychology term that you project your emotions onto someone else. So you're not really angry at Miss Susie, who looks just like your mother and has always been loving to you. You're really mad at your mom, who's never been loving to you. And so kind of in this hysteric state, basically take out all of your anger on someone else, on the person who actually has been nothing but loving to you. So it's possible that the Dermonds have been loving to this person, maybe even just in passing, maybe just at church. They always make sure to invite them over for lunch, but the person's never taken them up on it or something like that. They're like the parents or grandparents this person has always wanted. And for some reason, they have this utter pain in their life that fixates around Shirley specifically. And it's not sexual. I don't think it's necessarily sexual, but rather more of the caregiver, loving stand-in that perhaps this person is incredibly angry about. Because there seems to be no reason in which any of the ire that is poured out on this poor couple is deserved. I wonder if all of this ire is real in the perpetrator's mind. It was just projected on the wrong people, but the Dermonds were in fact the targets of this person. That's the only way I can make sense of this, because I don't think that the Dermonds did any shady business or did anything to make themselves vulnerable to this type of an attack. But I do think whoever attacked them meant to attack them, thought a lot about it, and there's a lot of interesting things about the way they decided to carry out this crime that don't make any sense for us when we're just looking at it as a black and white murder. So I wonder if it has much more to do with the projection this person is going through. And I say that because maybe that's where the police need to look in terms of who may have interacted with this couple, who may be a troubled youth, be a troubled teen, young adult, something like that, may have glommed onto the Dermonds because they felt akin to them, maybe because they knew that this sweet couple had a child who had fallen to addiction and been murdered. So maybe this son, who maybe this person never even knew, felt closer to where they were in life, that they felt close enough to the Dermonds that the Dermonds were like family to them, even if the Dermonds themselves never felt close to this person.
And I think this person or persons who did this are late teens or in their 20s. I think these are relatively young people. I think they're younger than you might think when you think about the supposed sophistication of the crime, because I actually think you're right. Look, it may turn out this was a botched kidnapping attempt to extort money. I actually think you're right. I think you're going to be right when they solve this case. I think there's going to be some strange thing going on there between that person or persons, and for some reason they are really focused on the Dermonds. It reminds me, and this is going to be really frustrating for everyone who's listening because I'm about to give you the most vague description possible, but there was a murder in some Midwestern state, and basically you had a mother. I think she was either getting divorced or had been divorced or wasn't very close with the husband. The police really focused in on the husband, thought he did it. She had a son as well. It was a brutal attack. She was killed in her kitchen. There was no forced entry. There was none of that stuff. And they ended up figuring out that, in fact, it was her son's best friend who did it. And her son's best friend had, like, her son, they had a great family. He had a great life. Everything was wonderful. She was incredibly kind to the best friend's son, to the point that he saw her as almost a mother figure. His family was completely broken. His father was abusive. His mother didn't care about him. The only person in the world who cared about him was this woman, and he murdered her. And in almost a very similar way to this, it was a very violent, bloody crime, and they eventually realized it was him. And there's just no real reason for it, you know, because how do you figure out somebody's mind like that? The weird thing about this case, I think there are several things that point to that there may be more than one person. The fact that you have arguably 3 weapons, the gun, the knife, the hammer. Now, I think the knife could be something that someone with a hammer or with a gun would also have. The fact that, you know, you're decapitating Russell, that's going to take some time and effort. Something is happening to Shirley at that time. She is being controlled somehow. Either she's been tied up or someone is holding her while this is going on. That, to me, all these things sort of indicate maybe this is more than one person who was involved in this. Even the taking someone out, tying them up with the cinder blocks and dumping them seems like it would be easier if you had 2 people. Now, a couple things, as we said. Was this always the plan? I mean, they brought the cinder blocks. They brought the paracord. They brought the knife. Did they always intend to dump Cheryl? And if they did, why didn't they dump Russell? Why do the decapitation? If the whole point is you believe that you're going to hide Shirley's body forever, if that's what you think is going to happen, why not do the same thing to Russell? Like, even if you're worried about the bullet, if you believe that doing this is going to dispose of the body forever, isn't that an easier way to do it than to spend all that time decapitating him, setting up the towels? I mean, just all the time you're spending in that home. And I feel like, once again, that points to some sort of connection. You know, we talk about this all the time with murders. The more time people spend with the victims doing things to conceal the crime, the more likely there is some connection. Because otherwise you just kill him and get out. Like we're talking about the mobster. The mob hitman walks in, kills him, and leaves, you know, and it's over. And he's done. And they'll never find him again, right? So things like that, I don't know. I mean, there's so many strange questions left unanswered in this case. I do hope it's solved. I think there's a really high likelihood it will be solved. I think the DNA evidence could be critical. I'm hoping that there will be new developments in DNA that will allow them to test that. And if nothing else, at least really limit the pool of suspects. If you have any information about the case, it's not too late. You know, this is not a cold case. It's a hot case. In fact, it's probably hotter right now than it has been at any point in the last 10 years. Call the FBI's Atlanta field office at 770-216-3000 or the Putnam County Sheriff's Office at 706-485-8557. If you know anything, let us know. If, like I said, like we always say, if you'd rather talk to us, talk to us. But if there's more than one person involved, I got to think somebody knows something. I don't think both people could have kept silent. I don't know that one person could keep silent about something like this, but I got to feel like somebody knows something.
What a strange case. And I really do hope with this recent kind of push, at least by law enforcement, it seems, and the increase in reward money, that this case will be solved, because what a tragic end to a beautiful life. You know, married for 68 years, 4 children, had to endure the devastation of one of their children being murdered, but seemingly just a wonderful couple who didn't really have an enemy in the world. To be ended like this has got to be so devastating for their family. So I hope for justice for them, and also to take this person off the streets because I don't think they are well. I don't necessarily think this person is a serial killer or necessarily is even out there looking for their next hunt. I don't think that's the case. I think this is a very disturbed person who needs help, and they have done something incredibly, incredibly horrendous, and they need to be brought to justice for it and also probably get some help.
Well, look, thank you guys for joining us. We've already mentioned 2 podcasts that talk about this. One I definitely want to mention is Zone 7 with Cheryl McCollum, not for least of which because we were on the show. So if you just can't get enough of us talking about this case, that is another show you can listen to, and she's always great. And she's from Georgia, and she has a lot of insight. If you have thoughts about this case, shoot us an email at prosecutorspod@gmail.com, at prosecutorspod for all your social media. Join Patreon, watch these episodes live, or get them early and ad-free. And we'd love to see you on the gallery discussing this case and all the rest. Well, we've gone a little long tonight, and Alice has to get to her beautiful baby boy. So we're not going to have any questions. We'll do one next week to make it up to you. Don't know what we'll be doing next week. Haven't decided yet. We're a little discombobulated with this whole like getting back in the swing of things. So
holidays.
Who knows? Who knows? I'll just make it up. We got a really interesting one for you next week. So make sure you come back. It's a great mystery. You're gonna love it.
It's such a mystery we don't even know it.
Such a mystery. Total mystery. Okay, guys. Well, thank you again. Thank you for recommending this case. Many of you did. It was always on our radar, but I'm going to give you guys credit anyway. You've asked us to cover this case. I'm glad we did. All right, guys. We will see you next week. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors.
It is Brett that's crying. He needed to dry his tears before we could go live. Look, if you need a sweatshirt, this is one of my favorites. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see.
It's for those of you who can't see, it's a Prosecutors. I think I have food stuck on it, so might be night cheese.
Can't remember what I called you last night. What did I call you?
I literally have no idea. I thought about that. I was like, did he forget to call me something?
No, I called you something, but I can't remember.
I
It was
really
something related to the
remember.
fact that you had been gone for a while. I have a new one.
I told you I'd forget everything within the hour. I made good on my promise.
I have a new one. So it's good.
I had to threaten taking that away so many times tonight with
Yeah.
my Squanto because he would not get in bed.
Pluto TV is the place for movie fans like me.
And TV fans like me.
They've got something for everyone, and it's totally free.
You can binge laugh-out-loud sitcoms like Frasier.
And rewatch cult classics like Higher Learning.
Whether you're in the mood to solve a little crime before bedtime with NCIS or Tracker.
Or curl up with a surefire hit like Forrest Gump.
Run, Forrest! Pluto TV has thousands of movies and shows, all for free.
Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.